The flight was direct from Los Angeles to New York, a night flight I took every week for work. At 37, with over a decade of experience with airport routines, I thought nothing would scare me until that night. It was a standard 737, with the lights dimmed and passengers quiet. After we took off, I noticed the seat next to me was empty. A relief. I always preferred flights with fewer people nearby. Shortly after, I fell asleep and woke up hours later without any reason I could explain. I looked around and saw that almost everyone was either asleep or wearing headphones. That's when I noticed something strange. A person, a man in a black suit, was standing in the aisle, right beside me. He was looking straight ahead, not moving a muscle, but his eyes, they looked empty, hollow, as if something was off. He seemed too cold, like the air around him was colder than usual. I felt tense and almost called for the flight attendant, but then he simply vanished. I thought maybe I was too tired and that my mind was playing tricks on me. A few minutes later, he appeared again, but this time 3 rows ahead, facing away from me. He seemed to float, always in the same position, and he didn't respond to anything. Nobody else seemed to see him. Finally, I decided I couldn't take that eerie feeling anymore and got up to ask the flight attendants if anyone had seen a man in a black suit walking down the aisle. But as soon as I described him, both attendants' faces turned pale. One of them, an older woman, turned to the other and whispered something I couldn't hear. "This passenger, this man in the black suit, he's been reported before," the flight attendant said. "No one knows where he comes from. He only appears on night flights, and whenever someone sees him, well," she stopped speaking. The silence, the cold, and the thinning air made it hard to breathe. And then, out of nowhere, the plane's lights went out completely. The very next moment, the man was beside me again, but this time, he smiled. In May 2018, I was returning from a work trip, and since I was nearly out of money, I opted for a red-eye flight, one of those almost empty night flights. When I boarded, I saw that the plane was practically empty, with only about 10 or 15 people on board. I figured it would be a quiet, peaceful trip. Little did I know what was in store. A few hours later, I felt a strong urge to use the bathroom. I got up and walked down the aisle, and that's when I noticed that one of the bathroom doors was locked with the occupied sign on. I figured someone was inside and waited. But as time went on, the occupied sign stayed lit. It seemed odd, especially since there were so few people on the flight. Finally, I gently knocked on the door to see if everything was okay, but no one responded. I went to ask the flight attendant what to do, and with a concerned look, he followed me to the door. "It's impossible for someone to be in there," he said, glancing around. "We didn't have anyone seated in that area." He tried opening the door with the master key, but as soon as the lock released, the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard escaped from inside. It was like a scream, but distant, as though it was coming from underwater. The attendant stepped back, looking at me with fear. The door opened, and inside was something eerie. On the mirror were handprints, foggy imprints, but they weren't in a normal position. The hands were upside down, as if someone had twisted themselves to leave marks that way. The attendant quickly locked the bathroom again and returned to his post, without saying a word. And for the rest of the flight, that bathroom stayed empty, but still, I could swear someone, or something, inside was watching me. That night, I had a 4-hour layover in an almost deserted airport. I was coming back from a wedding, and with the odd hour, the boarding areas were completely empty. I decided to explore a bit to kill time and wandered over to a quieter part of the terminal, where it was even more silent. After walking for a few minutes, I heard a whisper. I turned around to see who was speaking, but the hallway was empty. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the voices continued. "Come here, where are you going?" The voice was soft, almost familiar, but it sounded wrong, like a recording being looped, and the whispers grew louder with each step. I thought it was just exhaustion or my mind playing tricks on me. Finally, I decided to head back. However, when I looked around, I didn't recognize the hallway I was in. Then I noticed something bizarre. The departure screens were off, and there was no exit in sight. It was as if the hallway had shifted. I was locked in a deserted, isolated wing. Suddenly, the light started to flicker, and I saw a figure at the end of the hallway. He looked like an airport employee, wearing an old, faded uniform. I walked toward him, trying to ask for help, but as I got closer, I realized his face was blurred, like a smudged oil painting. He looked at me with empty eyes and whispered something I'll never forget. "We never leave." I ran, this time without looking back. The lights went out completely, and for a moment, the hallway was in total darkness, except for those whispers, louder and closer to my ear. When I finally found the boarding gate, the lights came back on, and the terminal was normal again. I went straight to my flight, and during takeoff, I looked out the window, half expecting to see that employee on the tarmac, watching me. It was midnight, and my flight had been canceled due to a sudden storm. The next one wasn't until morning, and the airport offered vouchers for a nearby hotel. But, since I was completely exhausted, I decided to sleep right there in a quieter corner by a window overlooking the empty runway. I dozed off in one of those uncomfortable airport seats when a faint noise woke me up. It was something subtle, like a soft tapping. I looked around, thinking it was a machine or part of the cleaning routine. The airport was practically deserted. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it, but the noise returned, this time closer and rhythmic, like footsteps echoing down the hall. I turned slowly and saw a man standing a few meters away. He was hunched over, carrying a suitcase and wearing an old-fashioned hat, the kind you'd see in photos from decades ago. He didn't move at all, just stared at me. His eyes, strangely, looked lifeless, too deep-set, and his face had a slightly grayish tint, like someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. I decided to ignore him and lay back down, assuming he'd leave soon. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel that he was still there, watching me. I opened my eyes, and he had moved closer, now only about 2 meters away, as still as a statue, staring at me unblinkingly. The air around him felt heavier, and there was a strong musty smell mixed with something like damp earth. My heart raced. I stood up quickly and went to the airline counter, but it was empty. The lights in the terminal seemed dimmer, and a strange silence filled the place, as if everything around had stopped. When I looked back, he was there again, the same motionless figure with vacant eyes, now even closer. I tried to steady my breathing and decided to leave the terminal. I walked down the corridor, but the man seemed to be everywhere, always appearing just ahead of me, standing silently, not blinking. When I finally reached the exit to the parking lot, I glanced back inside, and there he was at the doorway, with the same empty stare, as if following me without moving. That was the longest night of my life. When morning came, everything looked normal, and the airport was filled with people coming and going, as if nothing had happened. I boarded my flight the next morning, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But even now, whenever I travel at night, I avoid empty hallways, and once in a while, I swear I still see that pale figure in the distance, watching me with those same hollow eyes.